He was the man who for 7 decades walked with the Queen, accompanying, supporting and loving the most famous woman in the world.
And he was just perfect for the country at the time, perfect for the Queen. Must have been a special marriage.
His Royal Highness Prince Philip, Duke of Edinburgh, was the longest-serving royal consort in British history.
He shared a lot of the difficult times with the Queen in a way that no one else could.
As a partner in the most high-profile of marriages, his character influenced the evolution of the British monarchy.
He wasn't part of the great social set of England at that time, and so he was a breath of fresh air.
A fascinating, complex man, Prince Philip was the foreign-born noble who overcame tragedy before earning his place at the very heart of the British establishment.
He had an astonishingly difficult childhood, one which would have daunted, I think, anyone else, frankly.
He was the all-action sailor who served Britain with distinction during the Second World War.
It was always said by naval officers that he would have gone to the top of the Navy and he would have done it on his own merit.
Before sacrificing personal ambitions in service to royal duty.
He gave up everything for his wife, and there are not many men in this world who would do that.
If Her Majesty became the epitome of unbroken discretion and calm, Prince Philip was, by comparison, larger than life. And a man of strong opinions.
It remains to be seen whether those in political authority can shoulder their responsibilities in time.
He enjoyed getting things done, and getting things done means being outspoken.
Free-thinking and direct, the Duke of Edinburgh most certainly was, but ultimately he was also the husband whose devotion to his wife and to his adopted nation allowed her reign to be long and successful.
He has quite simply been my strength and stay all these years, and I and his whole family, and this and many other countries, owe him a debt greater than he would ever claim, or we shall ever know.
Prince Philip, as consort to the Queen, came to represent all things British. However, the man himself was famously, of course, not British-born.
Prince Philip was officially born as a prince of Greece and Denmark, but the Greek royal family actually had no Greek blood whatsoever because a Danish prince, his grandfather, had been sent down there in 1863 to become King of Greece, and his mother was a Battenberg, so she actually was a great-granddaughter of Queen Victoria, born at Windsor Castle in 1885.
It was a tumultuous time in Greek history. With the life of his father under threat following a military revolt, the infant Prince Philip was whisked to safety in a British warship as the family began years of exile across Europe. In later life, Buckingham Palace would become his official residence, but during those childhood years, Prince Philip would live at various times in France, Germany, and across Britain.
When people asked him later on in life, you know, what language did you speak at home, for example, what language did you speak at home? He would sort of shoot back very sort of furiously and say, what do you mean at home? Because essentially he didn't really have a home.
Philip was the youngest of 5 children and the only boy. As well as dealing with their life in exile, the marriage of his parents soon ended, his father effectively abandoning the family, his mother suffering a nervous breakdown, which meant the young Philip would be cared for by an English guardian.
He once said to me, my father was away, my mother was ill, I just had to get on with it. And that was very much his attitude all through life.
Prince Philip's family may have been royal, but after fleeing Greece had little wealth and were almost entirely dependent upon the generosity of their relatives. And it was those relatives who funded Philip's education, most importantly, allowing him to attend the newly established Gordonston.
Gordonstown is a boarding school on the east coast of Scotland. I was a boy there at the same time as Prince Philip. Now I'm back as a master. The same kind of lessons are taught as in most schools, and we play the same kind of games.
Gordonstown had been founded by a German émigré, Kurt Hahn, whose principles would leave a lasting impact upon the young Philip.
Prince Philip, through Gordonstown, developed a love of outdoor exercise and a real movement away from introspection. You don't want to sit around thinking about your feelings. You do your duty, and that's what's important. So Prince Philip was schooled in duty not only through a royal upbringing, but most of all through Gordonstown, when the idea was you create self-disciplined, organised, efficient individuals, not prone to too much introspection.
He had a sort of inbuilt self-reliance, even before he went to Gordonstown. But I think Gordonstown definitely helped to foster it and sort of build it into something more durable, perhaps.
It was while studying in Scotland that Philip was rocked by yet more family heartbreak when his sister Cecile was killed in a plane crash.
He was called into his headmaster's study at Gordonstown and told that his sister had died with all her family, and the fact that she was pregnant at the time, that really did upset him hugely.
One figure who would eventually help the young prince navigate such a difficult adolescence would also become his guardian, Louis Mountbatten.
Louis Mountbatten, when he took over the job of sort of bringing Prince Philip up, his first most significant thing was to steer Prince Philip away from his original ambition, which was to join the RAF, and to follow the sort of Mountbatten family tradition and join the Royal Navy.
The first step in that seafaring career would see the teenage Philip attend the Royal Naval College at Dartmouth, where he'd excel. Crucially, Dartmouth was the venue in July 1939 where his path would cross that of 13-year-old Princess Elizabeth during a royal visit. Lord Mountbatten had arranged for his 18-year-old nephew to escort the King's daughters.
He was extremely handsome, tall and blonde and suntanned and athletic. And I think he showed off a little bit, jumping over tennis nets and this kind of thing. And I think that both the Queen, or Princess Elizabeth as she was then, and Princess Margaret were pretty impressed. The Queen later on authorised it to be known that she had fallen in love with him then.
It was a meeting that was to some degree engineered by his Uncle Mountbatten, but what Uncle Mountbatten couldn't engineer was the fact that Elizabeth fell head over heels in love with Prince Philip. He was handsome, he was an excellent cadet, he was the top in his year, he was going on to a great naval career, and it was the beginning of the war. This was a time in which the great respect for sailors, the great respect for military service was absolutely flowering.
The meeting in Dartmouth was important, but the priority for all, of course, during the next few years would be the Second World War. Now a commissioned officer, Philip would serve the Royal Navy with distinction, even being mentioned in dispatches following the successful Battle of Matapan in 1941.
As the war progressed, he was extremely highly regarded as someone who was sort of very brave, very resourceful, a very good seaman. I mean, perhaps the only thing that people sort of said against him was that he occasionally, had quite a hot temper. But, fundamentally, he was an extremely able naval officer.
During the war, the Prince and Princess had corresponded, and with peace secured, the relationship could grow, with Prince Philip becoming a more noticeable presence within royal circles. However, though Princess Elizabeth was already won over, the prince was not welcomed by all.
The courtiers, some of them, particularly the stuffier of them, were quite hostile to Prince Philip in the early days. Of course, the fact that he had a lot of German blood in him and had, a lot of German relations, his sisters had all married Germans, that obviously wasn't going to be very popular immediately after the war.
Even though Prince Philip fought on the side of the Allies, had adopted Britain as his home, that didn't matter. They saw him as German. There were also some concerns about his character. They thought he was rough, they thought he was ill-tempered. Another courtier said maybe he's not inclined to be faithful. But really, it was snobbishness. It was that he wasn't quite of the right type of British aristocratic class. What they wanted was someone who was more easy to control, a British aristocrat who'd been to Eton, who would know exactly how to fit in with their ways of thinking.
He was seen as being under the influence of Louis Mountbatten, who was regarded sort of suspiciously, although he was related to the royal family. He was seen by a lot of the courtiers as being too left-wing, as being someone who wanted to sort of shake up the monarchy and modernise it in ways that made them feel uncomfortable. And it was sort of suspected that he planned to use his nephew, Prince Philip, as a sort of Trojan horse who was going to come into the British monarchy and bring it up to date.
Prince Philip told me that when he arrived at Buckingham Palace, he couldn't really quite believe how old-fashioned it was, how fuddy-duddy, how they were doing things, it seemed to him, still in the Victorian ways. And he set about a programme of renewal to kind of go through the whole works and see if it couldn't be made more modern, more up-to-date.
Prince Philip evidently had the confidence to deal with his critics in the royal court, but what he lacked was any degree of wealth, something which again marked him as an outsider.
In post-war Britain, a lot of people were poor, but Prince Philip in particular was poor, and this was very striking in these circles in which it was aristocracy, whose wealth went back for generations, who had huge amounts of land, gigantic houses, who saw themselves as Britain's rich aristocracy. Prince Philip, a man with nothing really more than what went in his suitcase. He was completely different, an impoverished young man.
He turned up at Balmoral to go grouse shooting. He famously went out shooting in his grey flannel trousers, and that's all he had. And I think there was something very refreshing about the fact that he, while a lot of courtiers would have looked down their nose at this, Prince Philip was there was a sort of unstuffiness about him and a sort of confidence that he could do this. He didn't feel that just because he was at Balmoral he had to go out. He probably couldn't have afforded it anyway, but go out and buy a pair of +4s. He would go with what he had to hand, which was a pair of grey flannel trousers.
Of course, no royal courtship could progress without the permission of the king, which, after some consideration, was forthcoming.
I think King George VI admired Prince Philip very much. I think his only real concern was that, that Princess Elizabeth, Princess Margaret, hadn't had much of a sort of childhood and adolescence, and then all this happened very quickly at the end of the war. And, the princess was very young, and I think he just wanted to have a little bit more time with her to be absolutely certain she was doing the right thing.
And now a British subject, King George awarded Philip the title Duke of Edinburgh. He was able to marry Princess Elizabeth in 1947.
Of them, however posed the photographs were, they were clearly a young couple who were so in love with each other, a very handsome young couple. And for the public, the idea of a love match and their beloved princess being in love was so exciting to them. People after the war were desperate for some good news.
There were grim times in 1947, austerity, post-war difficulties, and it was Winston Churchill who called their wedding in November 1947 a flash of colour on the hard road we have to travel. And I think that's how people saw it, a lovely party-ish occasion.
The years immediately following the royal wedding were among the happiest the couple would ever enjoy. As well as the birth of their first two children, Charles and Anne, Prince Philip continued his naval career with Princess Elizabeth happy to support her husband.
1947 to 1952, were, by and large, a very happy time for the young couple, particularly when they were out in Malta, where Prince Philip was stationed, and Princess Elizabeth could drive her own car, she could go to the cinema, she could go to polo matches, she could go and go dancing in the hotel and lead the life of a young naval officer's wife. I mean, just as the Queen said, that the Malta was the main place in the Commonwealth that she could consider to be home other than Britain.
However, one cloud in the life of the royal couple steadily darkened during this otherwise relatively carefree period. The health of King George VI began to decline, so much so that Princess Elizabeth and Prince Philip began to assume some of his public duties. In February 1952, while the couple were touring Africa in this capacity, King George died in his sleep. At a stroke, both their lives changed forever.
There they were out in Kenya, and the Queen was sitting in a treetops lodge watching animals at dawn at the watering hole when her father died at Sandringham in Norfolk in the early hours of the morning, and she didn't know. And then she came back to find Prince Philip very upset, telling her what had happened. And when he was told by his aide, the aide described him as looking as though half the world had fallen on him.
Elizabeth Alexandra Mary is now, by the death of our late sovereign of happy memory, become Queen Elizabeth II.
As well as the personal family loss, the prince was immediately aware that his naval career was effectively over, as he was now consort to the Queen.
I think he would have contemplated 20 years which they could lead their own lives, and during that time, undoubtedly his ambitions were concentrated on the Navy, and he might well have gone a long way.
The worst thing that happened to Prince Philip in the course of his adult life really was the early death of the king, because he wanted to prove himself in the Navy, and it was always said by naval officers that he would have gone to the top of the Navy, as did his uncle Lord Mountbatten and as did his grandfather Prince Louis of Battenberg, and he would have done it on his own merit.
The Crown of England, the Archbishop performs the simple yet the most significant ceremony of the Queen's coronation.
The coronation of Elizabeth II would take place the following year, in June 1953, an event watched by some 20 million people across the nation.
The defining day of Prince Philip's life was the coronation, because until then they'd lived pretty much as a wealthy but normal couple in the 40s and 50s. Now it is different. He is the consort. He is the consort to this great queen, to this major queen, and his job now is to support her and to support the role. And that's, I think, quite difficult for any man at that period of time. We're talking about the time of the 50s housewife, when it was all about the woman supporting the man. Difficult for any man, but particularly different for a man like Prince Philip, who's been a leader, who's been what we would say was an alpha male, a leader, an alpha male, a commander, and now his job is to support his wife.
The Duke of Edinburgh comes to vow lifelong allegiance to his Queen.
The Archbishop of Canterbury, he was all for keeping Prince Philip sort of out of the main part of the service as much as possible, and the Queen was equally as determined to bring him in as much as possible.
When Elizabeth had become Queen, Prince Philip expected, as was customary, the new royal household would cease to be Windsor and instead take its name from him as patriarch. But this didn't happen.
Prince Philip was absolutely furious and upset and said, "I'm nothing but a bloody amoeba. I can't even give my name to my children."
And he said that every man in Britain, even the poorest working man, he gives his children his name, and he could not. And that was a real blow to his manhood. It really was. And so it was very upsetting to the Queen, but she simply knew it had to be the Royal House of Windsor. It could not be the Royal House of Mountbatten. That was not possible. The politicians wouldn't allow it. The royal family wouldn't allow it.
And Winston Churchill, of course, was very, very distinguished, much older. Prime Minister, the Queen was very young, and he basically told the Queen that they had to be the House of Windsor. And Prince Philip actually wanted it to be called the House of Edinburgh after his title of Duke of Edinburgh, which doesn't really work either, because he wasn't a Mountbatten. I mean, he was a Schleswig-Holstein, Sonderburg, Glucksburg, to be quite honest. And how you translate that into Oldcastle or something, I mean, it just didn't work. But anyway, it was something which he did mind about, because it was normal that a man should give his name to the next generation.
Though unable to pass on his name, Prince Philip was to assume the leading role in the lives of their children.
The decisions about the monarchy, about the Queen's role, they are the Queen's. But the Queen said, you are the head of the family, you make the decisions about the children, and you make the decisions about their upbringing, about their education. So in a sense we see roles reversed. Often the man makes decisions about the overall leadership of the family, and the mother makes decisions about the children and their education. But that was given entirely to Prince Philip, so it was up to Prince Philip to decide where the children would go to school, how they were brought up, and the emphasis of their home life.
When Prince Charles was born, and as a little boy, Prince Philip certainly detected that he was a child lacking in self-confidence, rather shy, rather introspective, and wanted to instill confidence into him. And there are sort of two ways of doing this. I mean, some children need to be sort of nurtured and encouraged and sort of brought on very gently, and others need to be sort of like given rather toughening up. Think of them as like a plant. Some need a little watering, and others need to be stressed in their pots, and they produce great flowers. And I think that if Prince Charles would, if he were here, he would say that the methods used in his case were wrong.
But Philip was determined that they should go to Gordonstoun because he had been there, it had shaped him as a man, it was vital to him. So they were sent off to a boarding school, which you can see was a very good idea in terms of keeping the journalists away. It's an isolated place. You're going to see a journalist from a mile away. But Prince Charles always wished he'd gone to Eton. He never liked Gordonstoun. He really found the emphasis on outdoor activities, on self-discipline, away from intellectual pursuits. It was not a school that suited him.
Within the family domain, Prince Philip's function was head of the household. But in the public arena, as consort to the Queen, no role had been clearly defined for him. It would be up to the Duke of Edinburgh to carve it out.
Prince Philip was somebody who was a bit of a workaholic, if everything should be known. He was full of ideas, full of energy. I think it was quite difficult for the Queen and the courtiers to actually know what to do with him.
In response to this challenge, Prince Philip decided he could use his influence to champion areas of life often overlooked at the time.
Ladies and gentlemen, it is clearly our duty as citizens to see that science is used for the benefit of mankind. For what use is science if man does not survive?
British technology, science and industry were early beneficiaries, but the range of issues Prince Philip would come to engage with was impressive, illustrating from the outset he was a progressive campaigner well ahead of his time.
It's totally useless for a lot of well-meaning people to wring their hands in conference and to point out the dangers of pollution or destruction of the countryside if no one is willing or capable of taking any action. Well, sir, time is fast running out, and it remains to be seen whether those in political authority can shoulder their responsibilities in time and act quickly enough to relieve a situation which grows more serious every day.
Prince Philip started banging on about the environment, about fossil fuels being in short supply, oil running out, and he was talking about the environment in the 50s. But in the 50s, nobody took any notice because nobody knew anything about the environment. Nobody knew what the environment was. They just thought, oh, well, the environment is the air's fine, we're breathing it, we're all alive, hey, we'll just carry on living.
On a whirlwind tour, Prince Philip arrives in Cameroon to raise the world's awareness of the need to stop rainforests like this vanishing completely.
Conservation was a key issue for Prince Philip, and he was named president of the Worldwide Fund for Nature International in 1981. The appointment caused some controversy, as the Duke was a keen shooter, having once even hunted a tiger in India.
There was a time when you went on tiger shoots, presumably those days.
I never went on tiger shoots. I went on one shoot.
Not a thing that
I
was...
shot one tiger that happened to be lame at the time, anyway. And I imagine you weren't even born then anyway, so I don't know what you know about it.
Alongside his work in conservation, in 1956 he founded the Duke of Edinburgh's Award, the self-improvement programme for young people, which would eventually become one of his greatest legacies. His sincere desire to help the next generation make the most of their lives was evident from the outset.
This scheme is not a cure, it's a preventative. Once you've got a soccer hooligan, you've got a soccer hooligan, and somebody else is going to have to try and cure him of that. The purpose of the scheme basically is to try and catch people while they are moderately civilized still and keep them that way.
I have a feeling the reason why the Duke created the Duke of Edinburgh Awards was to make sure that there were people who were left behind were always thought about, given opportunities, because once you give a child or a young person an opportunity to prove themselves, they flourish, and that's what the Duke of Edinburgh Awards is all about.
So how would you sum up the identikit young person you might meet? Are they enthusiastic? Are they lazy? Are they inquiring?
Some of all. Yeah, I don't think you want to generalise about young people. It's very dangerous.
But there's no sense you have that they're less willing to take risks nowadays? We hear this talk
There's a great danger about being generalising about young people, because you can find somebody who's the exception, or not just somebody, but a whole group of them who are exceptions.
During his life, Prince Philip was actively involved with hundreds of charities and organisations. One of his strengths as an advocate was his willingness to speak his mind on a range of topics, while often writing his own speeches as well.
Prince Philip had a little bit more room for manoeuvre. He still had to support the Queen's neutrality, but he could encourage discussion and reach conclusions that perhaps allowed people to say and do what they thought.
With Prince Philip writing his own speeches made those around him, his staff, his secretariat, a little bit nervous, because they were never ever terribly sure what he was going to say until he delivered it. He was one of those people who tend to play close to his chest, and he'd never pass the speech around for others to see and others to vet it. He knew very well that he had to steer off politics, but there was a way of delivering a message that might have a political overtone and delivered in such a way that it didn't rock the boat.
However, Prince Philip's frankness could take his audience by surprise on occasion, as it did in 1969 while in Canada, where he seemed to suggest Canadians could sever ties with the monarchy, if so inclined.
I believe that it's part of the structure of our society, and particularly in this country and the United Kingdom. I think it's valid, but it is for the purpose of the community here, and this is how it should develop. If there is a consensus of opinion that it's outlived its value, well, then let's come to an amicable agreement about it. We should be beyond the point where we have to have a revolution or something about these things.
He enjoyed speaking out, he enjoyed getting things done, and getting things done means being outspoken at times.
He was a man who was ahead of his time. When you think of all the things he campaigned for, the environment, food, looking after the world, if you're ahead of your time, sometimes you're misunderstood, and I think that's what probably happened on many, many occasions to the Duke of Edinburgh.
In later life, and to his dismay, Prince Philip's comments would come to define him in the imagination of some. They were not talking about his work, they were talking about his gaffes.
He was very conscious that he'd become gaff man, and it annoyed him. He hated it. As he said to me, you know, when the Queen comes into a room, she is the Queen. And people respect that. She is the event. When I come into the room, well, I go down endless lines shaking hands, and I do at least try to make one person in the lineup laugh.
The Prince's latest gaffe was made as he accompanied the Queen's visit to an Aboriginal cultural centre. The palace leapt to his defence today, reportedly claiming that his comments were meant in good humour.
I remember once in Brisbane, and there were some Aboriginal elders, and he came up to them after the Queen met them, and he came second, of course, as always. But he said, I've just met your other tribe up the road there. He said, are you still chucking spears at each other? And they all laughed, and of course, when it was reported the next day, it looked awful for him. He was very angry about that, because the other tribe he'd visited earlier had told him that we used to go to war with them and we used to throw spears at each other, because he thought that was tremendously funny.
Some of the gaffes he shouldn't have said, some of them he didn't say, and they've just become urban myths. But when he said those sort of comments, for instance, the slitty eye comment in China, the fuse box which looked as if it had been put in by an Indian, I don't believe he was saying that out of nastiness.
I do remember once at a private dinner party, there were perhaps a dozen men around the table, all of whom knew the Duke well, and a friend of mine and a friend of his, more his generation than mine, began telling a joke that was clearly going to have some sort of racial subtext to it. And the Duke of Edinburgh, though this was a private occasion, stopped him and said, I don't think we like that kind of humour here.
I think he was just saying comments, like many people of his generation said, just trying to break the ice.
In the presence of the monarch, which tends to silence people rather a lot, even sometimes people of enormous capability and experience get totally tongue-tied in front of the Queen for some reason. But with Prince Philip, his sort of easy way with a joke really did break the ice, and walking, for example, onto a factory floor, onto some great occasion with hundreds of people there, just that little remark, you know, and people laughing, even if they hadn't heard the joke a little further down in the room, just sort of warmed up the occasion in the best possible way.
The guns were deafeningly close, and Prince Philip's amusement may well have been caused by the discomfort of the assembled photographers.
If ever he saw he was on a foreign tour, he saw there was a British news crew going to be accompanying it, his heart sank, because he knew all they would be looking for was the gaffe. And he said, I also know that the tour will not be reported at all unless there is a gaffe.
That sense of frustration led to a sometimes fractious relationship with sections of the media.
Prince Philip's views of the British tabloid press were always pretty hard. He didn't like them. He didn't like any of them. There was an occasion I remember so well when a reporter from a tabloid tried to be friendly, I suppose. It was at a press reception. I can't even remember which country it was, but said, how was your flight, sir? And Prince Philip said, have you ever flown? And the reporter said, yes. Well, it was just like that.
In a way, if you're presented with all these things and all those things, you know more or less that if you're going to say something, it's going to be taken down. But if you're having a conversation and somebody pokes one of these at you with a tape recorder behind, or one of those long listening devices which they can overhear a conversation 20 yards away, you get a bit anxious.
He resented the media, and that's because in the 50s and 60s he tried to work with the media. He was the person who brought television in, and he tried to build a constructive relationship. He felt that was just thrown back in his face.
You suggested to a chap with one of these things how he might dispose of it during a private conversation.
I'm delighted he took it down. I hope he did it.
The relationship between monarchy and media would become further strained during 1992, with some press reports criticising the cost to the public purse of repairing the fire-damaged Windsor Castle.
What rankled him, I think, about the press was the constant drip feed, certainly in the 1980s and the 1990s, constantly having a go, constantly having a snipe at the royal family, constantly having a go at royal family finances.
But there is every sign
that it was the public outcry over the Queen's finances which followed the Windsor fire, and with the Queen herself under criticism from some MPs for apparently making no gesture towards the cost of repairs, which has brought forward the announcement which the Palace, the Treasury and the Inland Revenue have been piecing together.
Headlines were also dominated by reports of the breakdown of 3 royal marriages.
The Queen was getting blamed left, right and centre by the media of not being able to control her family, which was a bit rich, suggesting that the Queen should be able to control her family, control their marriages. There's nothing that she could do about it. These are adult people, and if the marriage goes pear-shaped, then that's it. Nothing she can do about it. But she did have the support of Prince Philip. She was able to talk to him. He was a comfort to her. He'd always been a comfort to her, right from the day that they got married on the 20th of November 1947.
Without doubt, the most damaging incident was the separation of Prince Charles and Diana, Princess of Wales. For his part, Prince Philip was criticised by sections of the tabloid press for being cold towards his daughter-in-law.
And I think he was sometimes portrayed as, for example, being very critical of the Princess of Wales, of Princess Diana. But in fact, although I haven't seen those letters, but he wrote to her quite often in the 80s and early 90s and was compassionate in the sense, look, I know what it's like. I came into the royal family as a foreigner and as someone outside the British royal tradition. And I know acceptance is difficult and the media attention is difficult. And I think his attitude was a lot more sympathetic than he's given credit for from outside.
Unfortunately, he wasn't able to help that marriage, and I think he was very sad about it, because I think he hoped very much that they could resolve the situation, because he knew it would be damaging not only to them personally, which it undoubtedly was, but to this institution of monarchy, and therefore to his wife.
In their first official announcement, detectives investigating Saturday's fatal crash have said the driver of the limousine in which the Princess of Wales and Dodi Fayed were travelling had been drinking that night. The amount of alcohol in his blood well above the legal limit.
If the monarchy had felt under attack in 1992, 5 years later, in August 1997, the death of Diana in Paris would precipitate the fiercest criticism they had ever faced. As head of the royal household, Prince Philip would help steer them through this dark hour.
Prince Philip was a tremendous support to both William and Harry, as was the Queen. They were up at Balmoral when William and Harry were there. Prince Charles was there with them, their dad. And this was a tremendous shock to everybody. And what needed to be done was to help and counsel William and Harry to come to terms with the tragedy that had happened to their mother before they had to return to London. There was a lot of vicious press reporting aimed specifically at the Queen and Prince Philip for not being in London, particularly the Queen for not being in London at the time of the build-up to the funeral, not considering for a moment that William and Harry needed their grandparents and needed their father, needed to be shielded from everybody.
This week at Balmoral, we have all been trying to help William and Harry come to terms with the devastating loss that they and the rest of us have suffered.
With the royal family back in the nation's capital, behind closed doors, Prince Philip would help guide his grandsons through perhaps the most difficult event of their lives.
Emerging from St James's Palace, Duke of Edinburgh behind Earl Spencer, and they are walking down to the Mall just as the cortege will pass, and they are clearly going to take their places behind it and walk behind it on what is now the traditional processional route from here.
Philip knew that the protocol, whatever your age, was to walk behind the coffin of your parent, and William understandably wasn't sure whether he could do that. Now, it wasn't protocol for Philip to walk behind the coffin of his daughter-in-law, but he said to William, "If I walk, will you walk with me?"
And any footage that anybody looks at today or tomorrow or any time in the future, they will see Prince Philip gesticulating in conversation with William all the way along the processional route, pinpointing landmarks to take his mind not only off the tens of thousands of people lining the route, but the millions watching global television.
A reassuring pat on the back for Prince William from his grandfather.
There's a moment where they pass under the arch, coming through Whitehall and going down towards the Abbey. And knowing that at that point, or thinking at that point, that no cameras were on him, you can see him turn and speak very gently to William, as a grandfather would do. A moment of immense privacy in the midst of the most traumatic and public of events.
The idea of Prince Philip, the famously outspoken, often gruff consort, as a gentle grandfather may have surprised many. But perhaps that's because the Duke of Edinburgh kept that aspect of his character largely beyond public view. In private, according to friends such as religious scholar and conservation campaigner Martin Palmer, his warmer, spiritual side was more evident.
He had a strong but quizzical religious faith. He loved to ask questions. He loved to tease clergy of any tradition and denomination. But he also loved to hear different ideas of our place in the cosmos, our place in the universe. What were we here for? I think his religious quest was always to understand, why has God put us here? What are our responsibilities and duties? And how can we best fulfill those in order to be truly instruments of God?
I once had a conversation with him about spiritual matters, and he began talking in a most intriguing way about the connection between faith and the environment, between nature and science, and asking questions about what is God, what is God's purpose. And he saw me taking notes. He said, "Oh, you want to write about that? I mean, start writing about that, I think I'm a fruitcake." He didn't want that spoken about.
Prince Philip's religious beliefs may have been largely a private matter, but his lifelong passion for sport was there for everybody to see. He was a true man of action, from childhood right through till old age.
Very competitive, yeah, in it to win it, whether it was sailing or polo. In fact, he broke his arm playing polo, and the Queen banned him from playing polo. This was when he was in his 50s. So he did listen to the Queen, his wife, but he then took up, I think, an equally dangerous sport, which is carriage driving, which you see how fast those carriages go around turns and up and down hills. They have some pretty big crashes.
He was instrumental in writing the rules for the international competitions. So it was largely down to him that it became recognised as an international sport.
As he took a sharp left turn, the Duke was thrown. His two grooms also took a tumble. Both the referee, who was on the carriage, and the grooms ran to his assistance, but the Duke was not hurt. He scrambled back into the driving seat, minus his hat, and took over the reins again.
The Duke was never really interested in horse racing. He much preferred to watch the cricket. But of course, when the Queen had a runner, or he'd pick the horse in the sweepstake, he would be out on the balcony And this was a close-run thing. I think the Queen's horse was in the final 3. It was in the Derby, and it was really going for it. And the Duke really let go. You know, I never seen him like that before. And he just was screaming the horse home like everybody else was. But I just think it's just a lovely picture where he was willing it across the line. Unfortunately, it didn't win, but it was a great picture, and one I treasure.
As well as becoming Britain's longest-serving consort to a reigning monarch, Prince Philip was also the oldest ever male member of the British royal family.
I can only assume that it is largely due to the accumulation of toasts to my health over the years that I'm still enjoying them. It's a fairly satisfactory state of health and have reached such an unexpectedly great age.
Prince Philip had remarkable energy levels. When he celebrated his 90th birthday in 2011, he stated that he would, understandably, begin to wind down his workload. But in keeping with his character, that didn't seem to happen.
We were told every year that Philip was going to be scaling back his duties, but it really didn't appear that way. He was still really busy and not doddery at all. I mean, you wouldn't have thought he was his great age. You would have thought he was 10 years younger than that, but he was still very busy doing his own things, but also supporting the Queen.
This is a man who was a workaholic who basically wanted to live every waking hour and try to learn new things in every one.
However, even this most resilient of men suffered several health scares in later life. The most high-profile in 2012 during the Queen's Diamond Jubilee. Poor weather during the river pageant caused Prince Philip to become ill and then hospitalised with an infection, forcing him to miss some of the subsequent celebrations.
At the service at St Paul's, the Queen was going up the staircase at the cathedral on her own, and suddenly she looked really alone. You looked at those pictures and you thought, something's wrong here, what's missing? And of course, what was missing was the one person who's been by her side for more than 60 years.
I think just a good rest is probably required. Mind you, I think... Yes, inevitably, I think, so absolutely. And we were all... He's been watching it all on television, so...
Prince Philip would recover, but perhaps his absence had spurred some to reflect on the prospect of losing him one day. Now that day has come, what insights do we have about the real Duke of Edinburgh?
He would admit he was irascible and didn't suffer fools gladly, but he was a complicated guy. He was also very funny.
The Queen and the Duke certainly do seem particularly at ease here. It was the Duke himself who decided that they should spend the actual day of their anniversary on Malta for this very private of public couples. Quite a romantic gesture.
The first time I met the Duke of Edinburgh was at a luncheon, and I was asked to sit next to him, and they told me he was only going to be there for half an hour. He came and he spoke to the person on his right for 25 minutes. Then he suddenly turned to me and said, "So tell me, who are you and what do you do?" And I said to him, "I tell you what, my love, you tell me who you are and what you do, and I'll tell you all about myself," which he thought was hilarious. And we got on so well because I stood up to him.
Prince Philip was a stickler for accuracy. The details mattered to him.
I'd written a biography of him for one of his charities. I put somewhere in the book that during the Second World War, Prince Philip had served on HMS Ramillies. He said, "I didn't serve on HMS Ramillies." I said, "You did, sir. You gave me the logbook. I know you served on HMS Ramillies." He said, "I did not serve on HMS Ramillies." I said, "Excuse me, sir. You provided the logbooks, I've seen the photographs, you served on HMS Ramillies." He said, "I did not serve on HMS Ramillies, I served in HMS Ramillies." You don't live on a ship, do you? You live in a ship. You don't live on your house, you live in your house. You don't know anything, do you?
I mean, I do remember that I gave him Prince Philip, having been a sailor, was interested in naval history. And there's a book about Jack. It's a very, very big book. And I gave it to him after discussing it with him once at Sandringham, and he said he hadn't read it, so I sent it to him. And I mean, a week later, I got a sort of 4-page handwritten letter, which was a tremendous critique of the book. He was immensely assiduous and had beautiful manners. And he was wonderful company.
I remember at the time of the commemoration of the 40th anniversary of the Second World War, he was being interviewed by a television team about his own contribution. The interviewer asked him, well, what did it feel like? You were being fired upon and you were there in a huge naval battle during the Second World War. What did it feel like? And was it very frightening? He said, well, you just got on with the job. And then afterwards, there weren't counsellors around saying, look, do you feel all right? Are you okay? Are you going to be able to manage? You just got on with the job, And immediately that was picked up by the press saying, this is very unfeeling and all the rest of it. And I remember thinking, actually, that's the man. He just gets on with it.
The caricature of Prince Philip, as the sort of idiotic headlines of bluff, foot in the mouth, was so far and away from the truth of the figure that he was. I don't think I've ever seen a better looking, more amazing and more extraordinary man than Prince Philip. He was a truly exceptional human being.
Few knew Prince Philip better than his firstborn son, Prince Charles, who at one point during his own adulthood had been critical of his upbringing. That in turn had fed into a public perception of a difficult relationship between father and son, consort and future king.
Prince Philip is a product was a product entirely of his generation. He served in the war. He had an astonishingly difficult childhood, one which would have daunted, I think, anyone else, frankly. He grew up in the school of hard knocks, then went straight to the Navy. As I say, a very distinguished war, and so inevitably his character is different from that of his sons, because that's the way it works.
There was never any doubt that they both loved each other very much. They would always greet each other with a hug and a kiss and depart in the same way. Now, the difference is that they would have different views on different subjects, diametrically opposed views half the time. And so therefore there would be quite a volatile discussion going on. But as someone said to me, that doesn't mean they don't like each other. It just means they disagree with each other, and they would part with a kiss. And there was never any doubt that there was love between them.
That love of family grew as the royal family grew. Philip lived long enough to see the arrival of 8 grandchildren and see them marry. He was also able to welcome the arrival of great-grandchildren, a 4th generation of royals. Of course, the most important relationship of Prince Philip's life was with his wife, Her Majesty the Queen. And in terms of defining his contribution and legacy, it's her words that guide many.
All too often, I fear Prince Philip has had to listen to me speaking. Frequently, we have discussed my intended speech beforehand, and as you will imagine, his views have been expressed in a forthright manner.
The only person's opinion that really counts here is the Queen's, and she has said more than once that she couldn't have done it without him. He said he tried to support the Queen without getting in the way, and I think, on those terms, he was an incredibly successful and very important consort to the Queen. And as she said, we owe him a debt of gratitude more than probably we will ever know.
He is someone who doesn't take easily to compliments, but he has quite simply been my strength and stay all these years. And I and his whole family, and this and many other countries, owe him a debt greater than he would ever claim, or we shall ever know.
I think the Queen was absolutely right in what she said about the Duke of Edinburgh being her her strength and her stay over many years, because I think that it's clear it's almost an impossible job, the head of state, and to do so on your own, and it's quite a lonely place. I think that the one person that she could be absolutely confident and have confidence in was her husband, and so he shared a lot of the difficult times with the Queen in a way that no one else could.
If I had a proposal, she would often say, "What does Philip think? Have you talked to him?" And if I had, I would tell her. If I hadn't, I'd say, I haven't talked to him, but would you like me to do so? And she would say, yes, certainly. And once I did and came back to her with Prince Philip views, I can't remember any occasion where she didn't immediately say, well, right, go ahead. So I think he was a great source of both comfort, but also wise advice. And I think partly that was because he was a very intelligent, thoughtful man, but also because he was very independent-minded.
But after August 2017, that comfort and wise advice for the Queen came behind the scenes and not in public. At the age of 96, Prince Philip retired from public duties. Taking the salute at Buckingham Palace as Captain General of the Royal Marines was his final solo public engagement after 65 years of service. In his later years, there would still be important family matters to contend with. Less than 2 years after attending the wedding of Prince Harry to Meghan Markle at Windsor Castle, Philip saw his much-loved grandson withdraw from royal duties. This included Harry relinquishing his title as Captain General of the Royal Marines, a position handed to him by his grandfather.
Philip's reaction would have been one of great disappointment. He'd formed a very close bond with Harry over the years, so there'd been this long link between grandfather and grandson. Philip too, his whole life has been shaped by a sense of duty, supporting the monarchy, supporting the Queen, of course, first and foremost. And I think he felt that Harry was letting the side down. Philip, I know, did not approve.
There were other serious challenges for the family, with his son Prince Andrew stepping down from royal duties over his friendship with convicted sex offender Jeffrey Epstein. And at the age of 97, Prince Philip was involved in a car crash near Sandringham that injured a member of the public. Despite these events, the importance of the monarchy would once again come to the fore at a time of crisis, during the coronavirus outbreak. As the UK struggled with such an unprecedented emergency, Prince Charles was one of tens of thousands to be infected and spoke to the nation in a video message.
Having recently gone through the process of contracting this coronavirus, luckily with relatively mild symptoms, I now find myself on the other side of the illness, but still in no less a state of social distance and general isolation.
The Queen also spoke to the public, and Prince Philip was with her in Windsor as she gave only her 5th unscheduled TV address to the nation.
Together we are tackling this disease, and I want to reassure you that if we remain united and resolute, then we will overcome it.
Philip was in isolation with her at Windsor Castle, where the broadcast was made. I'm absolutely certain he would have cast his eye over the words that she was going to speak. The sentiment was very much the Queen's, of course, reflecting her own childhood and the epic years of the war, where she has such strong memories. And of course, Philip shares those memories because he was an active participant in the Second World War, and the Queen was able to use her own experience to frame her comments, and Philip would have helped her, if not draft the words, he would have certainly looked at the words to give it his sort of once-over, if you like.
It was a moment when the monarch was able to offer some comfort, with Prince Philip giving her his support as he had done for decades. The Duke of Edinburgh even gave his own rare public statement praising the work of those tackling coronavirus.
His life as a whole was one of service, of duty, of interest, and of doing things that would make the world a slightly better place. I think that's part of his legacy, is that virtually everything that he touched, Prince Philip improved and added something to.
It's been a challenge for us, but by trial and experience, I believe we have achieved a sensible division of labour and a good balance between our individual and joint interests. Because after 50 years of experience, I find there's a great temptation to give advice. The trouble is that no two marriages are quite alike. However, I think that the main lesson that we've learned is that tolerance is the one essential ingredient of any happy marriage. It may not be quite so important when things are going well, but it is absolutely vital when things get difficult. And you can take it from me that the Queen has the quality of tolerance and abundance.
I remember going on a tour with them, and at the end of the day, it'd been a very long day, the Queen and Prince Philip got into the royal limousine, and I was in the car behind with the Queen's private secretary and the equerries. And we followed them, and it was somewhere in the West Country. We're going down West Country roads, and in the car immediately in front were the Queen and the Duke of Edinburgh. And they'd been on their feet all day. And he was jabbering away to the Queen, non-stop, and she was roaring with laughter. And it was very touching to see this elderly couple getting on so well, so famously, after all those years.
Among the countless images he took of the couple, for Arthur Edwards, perhaps this one encapsulates best the bond between Queen and consort, husband and wife.
That was the last day of their last trip to Australia, and they were leaving that big barbecue in Perth to get the plane home, and the Queen was trying to see as many people as possible, and obviously not everybody could give their flowers to the Queen, and so the Duke was collecting the flowers and bringing them over to the Queen, and it was that look of her face at him, absolutely adoring at him, and taking the flowers, and it says everything, that one look on her face and his smile and the fact that they're so connected. We have to thank God for that man. He was just a brilliant, brilliant man, and he was just perfect for the country at the time, perfect for the Queen, and certainly we just got to be grateful we had him.
The Duke of Edinburgh served this nation during war and long years of peace. For 7 decades, he supported his wife and sovereign loyally. Though never seeking commendation, Prince Philip was unquestionably the foundation upon which Her Majesty's successful reign was built. And for that, above all else, he should be remembered.